Hey folks! Today I'll be talking about the review copy I received of Code Heretics turn-based strategic deck-building roguelite alphabet soup Against the Moon. Did this game manage to eclipse all of my expectations, or did it wind up driving me to lunacy instead? I'm your host Arlyeon, and let's find out together. And that means it's story time! Gather up, children, because today we're going to talk about a different Earth. One which succumbed to the machinations of a malign, moon. Not that one, though. A different moon. This moon. Seriously, though, I can get how this post-apocalypse happened, given that when the intro movie played, the first thing I thought was, that thing looks awfully pettable. Then I got the idea of its overall scale and its incendiary laser eyes and realized I'd be amongst the first to die, which means I'd be spared of living in the weird bastion city that our protagonists are apparently protecting, and that might be a fortunate way out, given the overall life expectancy of the good guys. Thankfully, the totally benevolent God Empress of mankind is there to make sure things run smoothly, with a fair bit of help from her empowered vassals, the Alturi. Which is to say, all of the protagonists. Oh, okay, that's also enough Warhammer references, please. Honestly, as much as I get the broad strokes of the premise, I admit that I wasn't quite as fond of the game's overall haziness on the nature of the calamity that had befallen humanity. Seriously, what's the deal with the moon? What kickstarted everything? For that matter, who's God Empress Arcs? Seriously, there's so many questions and not really much in the way of resources for answers, and this is important given that the game has a pair of story-oriented scenarios which are pretty dense narratively, and yet don't provide much in the way of clarification on things. Frankly, I came away with it with a sense of befuddlement and the distinct feeling that someone had a field day jamming as much technobabble as they could into the game script. Simply put, it's clunky. Honestly, I found myself a bit fonder of the story segments in the roguelite mode, given that they were events you could seek out to see the characters you chose in your party interact, reflect on themselves, and get some neat loot in the process. Unfortunately, it's married to some clunky writing both for the dialogue and the decisions you're offered. But it's a neat idea. You know what else would be a neat idea, however? Allowing players to click and toggle at the dialogue at once instead of waiting for the entire event to auto-scroll lest you skip to the next page. Anyways, that was a bunch of me being salty about its narrative, so let's move along to the mechanics. After all, this game combines so many genres that I'm fond of. What could go wrong? Well, let's introduce the premise. In Against the Moon, you're granted control of the Alturi, who need to defend the God Empress of Mankind Arcs. She's your health bar analog, while taking down minor lunar kaiju in turn-based strategy battles. What's interesting about our protagonists is that they serve a number of purposes in this game. For one thing, each of the Alturi has cards associated with them, which serve to form the deck you start with, or inject themselves in your deck when they join up with you in scenario missions. Admittedly, this actually messed me up a little bit in the second story scenario for two reasons. One, the second scenario is a lot harder than the first, but more importantly, because the game forces you to add cards to your deck. Yeah. That's right, despite that deck glut is a game killer in just about any deck builder, this game imposes it on you. Like, yes, it's nice that you can re-roll the cards they offer to you. Once. But holy shit, please don't force me to pick up new cards every round, especially in a game that curses players with low card draw. Oh, and good luck on shedding those cards out of your deck. Card removal does exist, but it's a limited resource, and one that must also be measured against resources like upgrading cards or other improvements we'll touch on in a bit. Because I'm still not done with the Alturi. See, they don't just influence the cards they have, they also have passive abilities. I mean, they don't start with them, but each one has a very small skill tree. Now, the abilities to get access to are generally fairly subtle, but can make up for some meaningful synergies between not only their decks, but also that of their peers. Only, planning around that can be a little bit hard. For one thing, you can't see a given Altari's abilities until you're actively in a run. For another, you can't even see anything beyond the initial ability, a skill tree that you're blind to unless you've invested a point. And given skill points are a limited resource and don't carry over between runs, that can make fine-tuning a bit of a nuisance, especially for those folks with memory issues like me. I can't even say that the Altari surface reliable units either, because yes, they do start summoned up in every round acting like a buffer between God Empress arcs and the monstrous moon minions, but you don't actually get to choose where they're summoned, which can completely screw you over in certain scenario maps based on where enemies spawn. Having an incredibly squishy Altari spawn in the same lane as a tanky monster that's scaling up in strength? Fraught. And also just plain depressing, given that each of the Altari have unique ultimate ability, which can help turn the tide of the battle if you spend energy, but only if they're conscious to use it. So, you know, things get awry pretty quick based on how RNG decides to spawn enemies in a lane. Especially given that once you start to lose ground, you're not all that apt to regain it, given that enemies will infinitely spawn in round after round. Seriously, the battle's just dragged on for a good portion of the time. And the fact that certain fights have events that occur within them that can utterly screw you over is, well, I can't count the number of times where an abrupt spawn of enemies turned a desperate resistance into an automatic loss, and the inability to see when it's coming, or to do anything to prevent it, was frustrating. And you know what? Speaking of not seeing things, here's another issue with the deck building part of things. See, there's a system in the game where you can upgrade your cards. It's yet another resource to hunt down that you need to balance against things like character upgrades, health for arcs, or card removal. What's important to note, however, is that a lot of the ways in which you can upgrade your cards are locked away at first. That's right, these cards have evolutions, but you can't access them because you need to unlock the evolutions by going to the laboratory at the home screen and spending research points to randomly unlock upgrades. There's no tactical element to this, it's just a gachapon locking you out of content and hoping that the prize you get is something useful. And then praying that you remember the useful upgrade when you're at the card acquisition screen, since you can't actually preview what cards evolve into when you're being obliged to add cards to your deck. Despite the fact that this should no doubt influence your tactical decision when you are adding cards, I don't even... All I want to do is make informed decisions to have fun. Why is this so hard? Then again, I should have expected this, given that some of the surprises that were in store during the scenarios, the second one has some absolutely dickish mechanics you need to adjust to in the middle of the fight, which can be a major hindrance to if you're going in blind. I had to restart that thing from scratch so many times, though I guess I still had more luck with it than the game's Luma runs, the randomized rogue mode that essentially serves as the crux of what you'd be doing when you're done with scenarios. Frankly, I just wound up getting dunked on there, sometimes because I made bad plays, but mostly because I wound up with a glutted deck, got a bad start, and it just became impossible to really make any headway once the enemy started rolling out all its forces. Thankfully, I at least managed to earn the option of changing around my character loadout, given you're initially saddled with a fixed team to tackle that content with. That said, if you clear the Monstro mission, you're given a new character as well as a variant, something which outstrips the singular variant unlocks you earn for beating the higher Luma runs. Seriously. I think my only fond memories of that mode were the little story sequences because they were tailored to the characters in your party. That said, they weren't my fondest memories of the game. Admittedly, that's reserved for the exceptionally frustrating Halloween-themed puzzle scenario. Seriously, it's not even that many maps, but they're extremely technical puzzles meant to test your understanding of the game's mechanics, and they're just so fucking hard. I lost track of how many times I messed up over the course of solving them. Like, just fiendishly difficult. And yet, I still found myself wishing there'd been more of these because they eschewed the unfair randomness I'd been suffering through in exchange for some very vicious conundrums. I was legitimately coming across encounters that I had to overcome through wits and skill, and I didn't feel like I was getting the carpet pulled out from under me. But it's not all doom and gloom. I do have to say that the graphics are fairly nice to look at, whether it's the opening scene, the character stills, or even the animations of the enemies and the characters yourselves, including the fact that their variants have different animations and looks. That said, I found the audio to be more of a mixed bag. The music, for instance, was alright, but I was a lot less keen on the voice acting, in part due to the fact that the dialogue doesn't necessarily align with the game's text at times. Or just the dialogue reading itself, given I wasn't a huge fan of the announcer. And that's a shame, since some of the other voice actors aren't too bad. Anyways, I'm sure you folks are as thankful as me that we've now arrived at the end, and I gotta say, I put close to 11 hours into this title, and I wish I had that time back so I could do something more productive, like watching paint dry, or perhaps measuring out the amount of force needed to cook an egg by slapping it. Seriously, my experience with Against the Moon was just so frustrating and joyless to the point that I frequently had to stop writing this review because I didn't want to go back to the game to verify or clear some of my thoughts. I dreaded doing so. And this is coming from someone who was eager to play it. I've been looking forward to seeing how it tackled turn-based strategy in deck builders. I was hopeful when I heard about branching card upgrades and hero customization. But the execution of everything is just so flipping frustrating. And I can't even take solace in having a story to gravitate to. If I wanted to wax poetic about technobabble, I'd watch Shatner-era Star Trek. Which is why ultimately I have to say I wouldn't recommend this game. Not even to a masochist, which is why I rate this game as a solid fail. Also, this was incredibly cathartic to just let out. Like, I feel like I need to crush a can of Dr. Pepper now. Just sit back, relax. Anywho, thanks for tuning in! If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you have an interest in supporting my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. There's also Discord, the link's in the description, so you can become part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. That said, catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.